Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. You may be seated. Today in Mark's Gospel, we are confronted with two different individuals. One a scribe and one a widow. And I think that in both of them we are given a little bit of insight into our own nature as human beings. And I hope and pray that as we approach this text today, we can look at both the scribe and the widow and maybe find ourselves in both of them. And not only find ourselves in both of them, but learn a few lessons about how to live a more godly and meaningful life in this world. And so that being the case, let's start off by looking at the scribe. Mark says this: teaching in the temple, Jesus said, "Beware of the scribes who like to go about in long robes and to have salutations in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts." Well, I would dare say that if a Baptist walked in and sat in one of our pews today, they might look at us and say, "Hey, he's talking about you." Am I right? Here we come with our long robes. We've even got tassels right there. And we have our best seats and we receive our salutations. And as a matter of fact, I remember having been one of those low church non-denom evangelicals, and I actually used this very verse against people like me that I've become. And not only that, but I think that many of us could sit here and see ourselves in these words. After all, Jesus seems pretty clear to be condemning those who go about in long robes and to have salutations and so on and so forth. But I think that if we do that, we're missing something. We're missing something very important that keeps us from fully understanding the text, from fully understanding what it is that Christ dislikes here. And we keep ourselves from seeing a very serious danger to our souls and to the souls of others. There's one very special word that if we miss, changes the entire meaning of the text. Let me read it again very carefully. Jesus says this: "Beware of the scribes who like to go about in long robes." Did you hear that word? Who like to go about in long robes. You see, Jesus here is not condemning long robes. He's not condemning liturgy. He's not condemning ceremonial. He's not condemning the office of scribes or of priests. Rather, he is condemning those who like those things and their effects. He is condemning an inner disposition of the heart, not outward ceremony. And of course, why would he condemn such things? Wasn't it God himself who from Mount Sinai ordered his temple to be built in such and such a way? Ordered such liturgy to be done in such and such a way? Ordered priests to wear vestments in such and such a way? If we condemn Christ, if we interpret Christ to be condemning outward ceremony, then we are calling him somewhat of a hypocrite. Because it was God himself who ordained those things in both the Old and the New Covenants to be done. No, if we miss that word, or those two words, who like to go about, then we've changed the meaning of the text. But then again, if we take the text for what it is really saying, if we hear Christ's condemnation for what it truly is, if we hear Christ as condemning an inner disposition of the heart and not just an outward ceremony, then that opens his condemnation up to each and every one of us. Don't we all in some way like our material things? Even sometimes to such an extent that it can become a harm to others. And that, my friends, is the great danger. Christ is condemning an inner disposition of the heart. And while there is nothing wrong with material things, with wealth, or with the things that we do with them, if we identify ourselves with those things, if we attach ourselves to those material items, if we begin to value them over other human beings and over other persons, then we have gone a step too far. And I think that this is especially something that we in America need to hear, because we are so very much attached to our materialism, to such a degree that I think we can hardly even begin to realize. I remember when I first got married. When you first get married, you realize that everyone has some junk that they want to give you. It's kind of a tradition in our culture. And if someone gets married and you say, here, have my old towel set. Here, have my old sofa. Have our old bedroom set. Have our old kitchen table. And next thing you know, your entire little apartment is filled up with things that you never even had to buy. And they're still nice. We, as Americans, are so buried in our material that we can even furnish someone's house off of entirely our junk. And it's even nice junk. But that means that we as Americans are also especially susceptible to putting value on mere material things that those things in and of themselves do not deserve. I think that each of us has to be ready to hear Christ's warning that this inner disposition, this inner attachment to material things, can be gravely dangerous to our souls, to the health of our spiritual life, and to the health of our society as well. Now with that, Christ moves on, and he just juxtaposes with this scribe also this poor widow. Let me read the text in full. It says, and he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the multitude putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums, and a widow came and put in her 2 copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples to him and said to them, truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all they contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty. Now, I think there's a way to read this in which Christ is essentially just giving a math lesson. Am I right? In a sense, it's really quite obvious. You have all of these rich men who come in and they put in what looks like a lot of money. But if you take it in terms of percentage, maybe it's not even 1% of their entire value. And then you have this poor woman who only owns 2 copper coins. And she puts in 100% of her value. So obviously, to a certain extent, it's obvious. Christ didn't even need to say this, did he? She put in 100%. And percentage-wise, she put in more. But I don't think that Christ is merely giving us a math lesson. I don't think he needs to give us a lesson in something that is so obvious. As a matter of fact, I think there's a great more happening in this text. Which, for instance, did you notice that this is not the first time in this text that a widow is mentioned? If we go back up to the scribe, I think you might notice that he ends his condemnation with this: who devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Isn't it amazing that health and welfares and TV preachers have been around for 2,000 years? But I think it offers us a grave warning that our attachment to material things can become so strong that we end up hurting others for the sake of our things. I have to wonder as I read this text if this is one of the widows who had been wheeled and dealed out of her stuff. I have to wonder if these were her last 2 pennies because all the rest of them were taken by this scribe. I have to wonder if she'd lost her house because of the false teaching and because of the love of this scribe of material things. When Jesus condemns this attachment to material things, he doesn't just condemn the interposition itself, but he condemns also all of the terrible things that result from it within society. And he wants to let us know that this poor widow, and all poor widows like her, are not missed from his sight. He sees them, he knows them, he loves them, and he himself is more attached to them than he's attached to physical things. But even then, I think that there's another lesson from this widow as well. And that is precisely what she's doing. Here she is with her last 2 mites. Do you know what it is that this treasury was likely for? It was likely there to help the poor. Here is this woman who could have benefited, who needed the benefit of these things, probably more than anyone else that was putting money into it. But nonetheless, she gave the last of what she had to help others and to help someone else. She herself had achieved a certain detachment from material things, which Christ is holding up to each of us. And he is teaching us through this woman that by means of detaching ourselves, instead of attaching ourselves to materials, we actually enable ourselves to invest in the spiritual. By detaching ourselves from the seen, we learn to invest in the unseen. By devaluing the material things, we begin to value spiritual things. And we can learn to grow and to see human beings for what they really and truly are. This woman, no matter how little she had, was willing to stretch out her hand and help others who she saw as just like her. So the first thing that we can learn from this text is, first of all, that we must condemn the inner disposition of our own hearts insofar as it is attached to material things. And secondly, that we ourselves must learn, like this poor widow, a detachment from material things so that we might devote ourselves to spiritual realities. But I think there's one more lesson that we can take away from this text today. Christ continues and finishes with the last sentence here. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put everything she had, her whole living. By putting every single thing that she had that could be assigned to her name into that treasury, she did something very, very important that couldn't escape the notice of Christ. She wasn't just devoting her money to God in that treasury that day. Rather, she was devoting her whole entire self. And that, my friends, is truly what it is all about. I am reminded of our gospel lection last week from Mark chapter 12, in which Christ speaks of the greatest commandment, and the one which is like unto it, which we rehearse every single Sunday in this church. It was said in Mark chapter 12, he says, "Indeed there is no other God but he, and to love him with all the heart, with all the understanding, with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself, is much more than all the whole burnt offerings and sacrifices of the law." The whole point of the entire sacrificial system of the Old Testament was to point to the true sacrifice that God really wanted, and that was the sacrifice of ourselves. And I am afraid that what was really happening that day in the treasury, as all of those rich men would come in and put in these buckets of money, was really just nothing more than a distraction from the true problem. And can't we do the same thing? Watch, I'm going to put in this whole bucket of money to display my devotion, but I'm going to keep this part of myself for myself. I'm going to come and sit in the pew on Sunday morning, but I'm keeping my Monday to myself. I'm not going to give God this part of my life or that part of my life, but I'm going to let other people see that I read my Bible and go to Bible study and do this and that and the other. God is not interested in the partial sacrifices, but the sacrifice of the whole heart. We don't come here and sit in these pews so that others can see how good we are. We don't sit here in these pews to give this just the Sunday to the Lord. Rather, as our communion service reminds us, here we offer and present unto thee, O Lord, ourselves, our souls and bodies to be a reasonable, holy, and living sacrifice unto thee. We come to devote our whole and entire selves to him, that we may be his and he may be ours. It is only in this act, the act of full and total self-devotion to the triune God, that we enable ourselves to detach from these material things. That we enable ourselves to devote ourselves to spiritual things, to spiritual realities, to see the value of the other person, and to give whatever we must give for the sake of others. To become truly Christ-like and to give our whole selves. In this passage, we learn the danger of attachment to materialism. We learn the value of detachment and of spiritual investment. And we learn that the greatest sacrifice of all is the sacrifice of our whole selves. May we learn to come and do these things. May we sit in this pew. May we receive this holy sacrament in order to offer ourselves to him, that it may be said of us what was said of that poor widow. Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.